Okay, so this video is going to help you with chapter 6.1, part of the core, and option chapter D2, which covers part of the core option chapter on human physiology. And both of these are all about the process of digestion. Okay, so before we talk about digestion, we need to understand the difference between a couple of words, and they're subtle but very important. So ingestion, taking in and eating food. Okay, so this starts with the mouth, I hope. Okay, digestion, the chemical breakdown of food from bigger molecules into smaller molecules. So this is a chemical breakdown, not physical. Okay, where we're taking things like, I don't know, like maybe a polypeptide and breaking it down into its individual components. Okay, then we have absorption. So absorption is something that ends up with those molecules being in either your bloodstream or your lymphatic system. So getting the molecules out of the food and into your bloodstream to the rest of your cells. And then we have transport, which is how those small molecules are delivered to the tissues via the circulatory system. Okay, now when we ingest food, okay, we're ingesting the four types of major macromolecules, and then we're going to break them down. So the first one is nucleic acids. So everything that we eat is made of cells, and all cells contain DNA. So we eat DNA all the time, and we break that down into nucleotides. We also ingest proteins, which are going to be broken down into their amino acids. So again, some of you have asked me, like, where do we get the nucleotides for DNA replication? Or where do we get the amino acids that we use to make proteins? Well, we get them from our food. Okay, we're also going to be breaking down lipids into glycerol and fatty acids. Okay, so a triglyceride is going to be glycerol plus 1, 2, 3 fatty acids. Okay, and during digestion, we're going to break those apart. All right, and then we have carbohydrates. Okay, so we can ingest these in a multitude of ways, either as monosaccharides, disaccharides, or polysaccharides. Okay, but the end game is to get them all broken down into monosaccharides. Okay, so obviously if they're already a monosaccharide, we don't have to break them down any further. But these larger complex or polysaccharides, we need to break down. Okay, so here's where our old friends enzymes come in. So remember, enzymes help to facilitate a lot of different types of reactions. In digestion, they're all going to be catabolic, which means that we're breaking large complex molecules down into their individual components, and doing that releases energy. Okay, and so we need this process to happen. One of the ways to speed this up is by increasing the temperature. Unfortunately, since this is taking place in our bodies, you can't do that. You can't just increase the temperature to make things go faster without destroying our cells. So the enzymes help this process to happen without a necessary increase in body temperature. So at the end of the day, what they're doing is they're breaking big molecules into smaller ones, and they're helping to release some of the energy that's in our food. Now, if you're at some fancy pants place, okay, you may also hear the digestive system referred to as the alimentary canal. It is literally, this is so cool, one continuous tube, okay, that does all these crazy loops and turns, but it's never broken, it's never blocked, it's never stopped, it never goes anywhere else. It is one long muscular tube. That's important. We'll talk about that later. So it begins in the mouth and it ends in the anus. Okay, that's not labeled down there, but I assume that you know where that is. If not, you should not tell anybody about it and Google it. Okay, so starting in the mouth, ending in the anus. And now let's draw this sucker. Okay, so here's the mouth. And the mouth extends into a tube called the esophagus. We'll go back and label this later. So the esophagus is in your neck. so is another trachea, or another tube called your trachea. You got two big tubes in there. One goes to your lung, one goes to your stomach, and your esophagus goes to your stomach. And well, I shouldn't even say it goes into your stomach. It literally widens to become the stomach. Okay? And then the stomach is going to narrow to become the small intestine. So I'm going to start drawing the small intestine, but I'm not going to draw it the whole way. And I'm sorry, these are not supposed to be like disjointed like that. They're supposed to be one long continuous line. I doubt it'll let me try to fix that though. Okay, anyways, going into the small intestine is another tube. Okay, we'll talk about that later. For now, I'm just going to say that from the mouth into the esophagus, into the stomach, into the small intestine, away we go. And that small intestine is going to curve around and around and around. It can be up to 3 times your body height. So if we're talking about a full-grown adult, maybe up to 18 feet. Okay, that is a long way, and it's one continuous tube there. I'm obviously not going to draw all of that. We're going to end there. And then it widens into your large intestine, okay, which I'm going to draw kind of like this. Okay, so we kind of have 3 parts of your large intestine, the ascending, or it goes up, transverse, so I'm showing it going behind the small intestine here. Okay, so transverse and then descending. You may also hear that referred to as the colon. Okay, and then it's going to narrow, and then we have the out hole, which is the anus. Okay, so now let's take care of this problem up here. Into this little duct, okay, we're going to have the juices from 2 very important digestive organs, okay? And so I'm going to draw a branch for each of them. One of them is kind of tucked over here on this side, and that is your pancreas. And the other one is your gallbladder, okay? And so what's happening is your pancreas and your gallbladder are producing juices that both empty into the small intestine. So where they kind of meet up here is called the common bile duct. Okay, they're joining first, okay, then squirting things into the small intestine. And your gallbladder is, of course, part of your liver. Okay, so let's go back and label some of these parts now. So I'll do this in red. We have the mouth. The mouth widens into the esophagus, which widens into the stomach. The stomach flows into the small intestine, which then widens into the large intestine. And we're also going to call that the colon, so we'll just say that that's the ascending, transverse, and descending colon. And then we have the rectum, which is the part right before it comes out, and the anus. Okay, so of course, we then have the pancreas and the gallbladder, which both empty into the small intestine via the common bile duct, and this is your liver. Okay, so just to show you one last time where we're at here, okay, food flows from the mouth, down the esophagus, into the stomach, into the small intestine. Some juices get squirted on it there, okay, but it keeps on going through the small intestine, through the large intestine, and out the anus, all one long continuous tube. How does it do this? Okay, well, it does this through an action called peristalsis. And peristalsis squeezes the food through the digestive tract using muscular contractions. So you can actually eat hanging upside down or in zero gravity. It doesn't matter. Our digestive system doesn't rely on gravity. It relies on two muscle contractions. One which squeezes your digestive tract inward, okay, and then it also squeezes things downward to move something downward, or I should say through your digestive tract. Okay, so speaking of your digestive tract, let's take a closer look at one of the more interesting sections here. Okay, we're going to imagine that out of this super long, crinkly, small intestine, okay, I make a slice, okay, just through one section though. Let's not get carried away. Just one slice. So imagine your small intestine is a long piece of bread, and I take a slice out of the middle and then turn it on its side. This is what I might be looking at here, okay? So let's draw this. It's going to be a circular tube, okay? So circular tube, again, we're looking at a cross section here. And this circular tube has not one, but two layers of muscle. Okay? It's got an outer layer of muscle called longitudinal. Okay, and the longitudinal muscle is what squeezes things through the digestive tract, or I was accidentally saying down, okay, because that was what was in the picture, but this squeezes things along the digestive tract, and then right inside of there, we have a layer of circular muscle, okay, which kind of squeezes the diameter of that small intestine. Okay, so if I'm looking at this picture, again, here's the longitudinal muscle. Here's the layer of circular muscle. What the heck are all these crazy, freaky, fingery things? All right, these crazy, freaky, fingery things have a super important function here, and they are called villi. Villi is plural, villus, us would be singular. Okay, so what we're actually looking at when we're looking at the villi, they're actually like solid, you know, almost like finger-like projections. That's what we're looking at here. It's not a space. It's actually something that sticks out into the middle of the small intestine. So it kind of looks a little something like that. Okay, and then we've got this space on the inside where the food actually goes through called the lumen. That may sound familiar to you if you've already studied like arteries and veins. Okay, and you know that's the name for just the hole where the stuff goes through. Okay, so just one more time, I've got the longitudinal muscle here on the outside, squeezing things through the digestive tract. And then I've got the circular muscle just inside of that, okay, and that's squeezing the diameter, okay, and then I've got these villi and the lumen. You're going to have to know how to draw that. You're going to have to know how to identify that, and be careful because you may also be asked to identify just a section of it, and it looks kind of strange when you only look at part of it and not the whole thing. Just remember the order of the layers: longitudinal, circular, and then the villus. Okay, so in our drawing of the digestive system, we included that weird lumpy bumpy organ called the pancreas, and the pancreas is pretty good at secreting some enzymes. When we get into hormonal control, guys, there's so much more that the pancreas does, but in terms of digestion, we want to be thinking enzymes, okay? So I don't know why I just underlined during. I meant to underline digestion. Okay, so the pancreas produces a few enzymes, one of which being something called lipase. Again, ASE is an ending for enzyme, so it's something that acts on lipids. and it breaks them down or hydrolyzes them into their glycerol and 1, 2, 3 fatty acids. Okay? The next thing, okay, we're going to take a look at here is amylase. Whoa, that was scary. Amylase, so lipase, amylase, and amylase hydrolyzes starch. So remember, starch is made of many glucose monomers. It doesn't break them up into glucoses. Amylase breaks them into maltoses, groups of 2. They'll get broken down into glucoses later on by another enzyme. And then we have the third one here, trypsin, which is going to take a really long protein and break it down into shorter segments. Not individual amino acids just yet, okay, just shorter segments. Okay, so here's a little bit closer look at that common bile duct we were talking about before. So the duct here from the pancreas joins the bile duct, and they both squirt into the small intestine. The only problem with that is that the food has just come from the stomach. So the food is going this way through the stomach into the small intestine. And inside of the stomach, we have a pH of around 2. That's pretty daggone acidic. The enzymes that come from the pancreas need an optimal pH of around 7. So if the pancreas squirts its enzymes into the area where they've just come from the stomach, we're going to have a problem. This low pH is going to denature all of my awesome pancreatic enzymes. Okay, so what we're going to talk about a little bit later is the pancreas is also really crucial in secreting what we call a buffer, and it takes this really acidic pH that's coming from the stomach and it neutralizes it, okay, to bring it back up to a pH of 7 so that all those cool enzymes are working at their optimal rate. Okay, so the pancreas may be one of the ugliest organs, but it's also really important, and we're going to see its importance pop up in future chapters. So in this chapter, we're interested in its digestive enzymes, okay? And those digestive enzymes are produced by these cells. I picked a really bad color to circle these with down here at the bottom. That was dumb, okay? But they're down here, okay? And they're all attached to a duct or a tube. Okay, because these are leading directly to where they need to go. They're leading from the pancreas down here into the small intestine, right? Okay, well, the pancreas also secretes hormones. Hormones go directly into the bloodstream. So those are going to come from cells that are like this, that are going to produce hormones that go into the blood, that go everywhere. So the pancreas is quite complex, actually. It's got cells that produce digestive enzymes that go through ducts into a specific spot, the small intestine, and it's got cells that secrete things into the blood like hormones. Those cells that lined the duct, those are called exocrine glands. Okay, exo, out of, trying to get out of that organ and into a specific location. So exocrine glands, they can be like your sweat glands or your salivary glands, okay? They have a tube that takes them to a really specific location, okay? And so we just talked about those with the pancreas. There are a few others, okay? So again, the salivary glands produce saliva, and that contains enzymes like amylase, and it takes it to a really specific spot. You also have this juice called gastric juice, and it comes out of these things in your stomach, these little holes in your stomach called gastric pits. Again, they're going to a very specific location. That's what makes them an exocrine secretion. All right, we also have pancreatic juice, which we just talked about. So it's created in those pancreatic cells. Again, we're talking about the exocrine cells, not the ones that produce hormones. Okay, and it's carrying them through this duct into the small intestine. Those contain those enzymes that we just talked about, and it contains that buffer that we just talked about to neutralize the acid of the food that's coming from the stomach. Okay, and then we have bile. We're going to talk a lot about bile in the next chapter on the liver, but bile comes from the gallbladder, okay? And so because it's coming through a tube to a specific location, that's what makes it an exocrine secretion. And it's going to help us to emulsify or mix lipids. So instead of having these giant clumps of lipids in the food that's going through your small intestine, it breaks it down into smaller clumps with more surface area so that we can digest them easier. Okay, so next I want to take a look at those gastric pits we just mentioned that produce what we call gastric juice. Now, your stomach is a muscle, okay? That's why it's able to expand and contract. And if I take a look at the wall of your muscle, I'm going to notice there are these holes or pits. Okay, so we're going to draw just one of them. And it's going to look something like this. Okay, so now remember, okay, what I'm looking at here is just this hole. The rest of this surrounding it is the muscle wall of the stomach. Okay, and then you don't have to draw this part, but it would basically be looking like this. And here would be the lumen or hole of the stomach where all of your food is. Okay, so here we go. Lining your lumen, okay, is a layer of mucus. So this is a mucus layer. You have to remember that this is a pretty gnarly acidic environment inside of your stomach. And since the walls of your stomach are made up of muscle, we use a protective layer of mucus that goes all the way around to protect the muscular wall from that really destructive acid. Okay, so these gastric pits are going to be lined with cells. And so I'm going to draw a little nuclei in my cells just to remind myself that these are cells and not like marshmallows. And these cells are going to come in three basic zones. Up here at the top, we have mucus secreting, mucus secreting cells. And that makes sense to me, right? So if the job is to get mucus up here, we need cells to produce that mucus that are like right near it. Okay. We also have cells, okay, that secrete something called pepsinogen. So pepsinogen secreting cells. Okay, they secrete an enzyme called pepsinogen, but it's not active until you put it into an acidic environment. So we have these cells down here to secrete hydrochloric acid, HCl. So these are my HCl secreting, that's an E, HCl secreting cells. Okay, and so they're going to secrete the acid, okay, that these guys need, or well, the pepsinogen that these guys produce need in order to become an active enzyme. Okay, so for my students, I hope you've been listening closely because you're supposed to also annotate with the functions. So you should be able to annotate the function of the mucus, the function of the mucus secreting cells, that shouldn't be hard, the function of the pepsinogen secreting cells, and the function of the HCl secreting cells. Okay, so we already know that your stomach is connected to your mouth via your esophagus, right? Okay, well, it's also connected to a variety of other organs, including your brain. And it's connected via your brain to your brain via a nerve called the vagus nerve, vagus, not Vegas like party Vegas. That's different. Okay, so when you're getting ready to eat, okay, that feeling of hunger signals a part of your brain near the brainstem called the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is going to send a message along the vagus nerve, so all the way down here to your stomach. And it tells those gastric pits to start secreting digestive enzymes. Like, hey, food is going to come soon and I want you to be ready. By the way, this may sound familiar to you if you've already done some work on the heart rate and stuff. Okay, same part of the brain. Anyways, when enough food has been ingested, okay, what's going to happen is this stomach is going to expand. It's going to get bigger. It's going to get full of food. Okay, this extension causes, again, a message to go along the nerve pathway from the stomach to the brain this time, okay? And it tells the medulla oblongata that, hey, I've got food in here. What the heck am I going to do with it? The medulla oblongata says, yep, message received, sends a message back down to the stomach to create even more gastric juices, okay, to deal with that increased volume of food, okay? So the medulla oblongata is telling the stomach to create digestive juices both before and after a meal. Now, we don't want to secrete gastric juices for forever, so how does that stop? Well, right here, separating the stomach from the small intestine, you have a valve, and that valve is called the pyloric sphincter valve, and it opens and closes to either, well, if it's closed, keeping food in the stomach, or when it opens to allow that food to travel down into the small intestine. So again, it has a physical role in the opening and closing, okay, but it also has a biochemical role. When this pyloric sphincter valve opens and allows the food to go into the small intestine, I don't need all of these gastric juices anymore because the food is going to be leaving. So when that valve opens and lets the food go through into the small intestine, that process secretes a hormone that stops the production of the gastric juices. Okay, so it's the medulla oblongata in the brain that gets those juices going, and it's the opening of the pyloric sphincter valve that triggers a series of reactions that stops that production of gastric juice. Okay, now let's go back and think about the stomach for a moment. So we keep talking about gastric juices, low pH, Okay, the low pH in the stomach basically stems from the production of HCl, hydrochloric acid. And the hydrochloric acid in our stomach is going to have three main functions. So the first thing it does is it denatures proteins. So the proteins that we eat are kind of all balled up and folded up in their tertiary or maybe other levels of protein structure. And the denaturation process from the acid kind of causes them to unfold. This is going to be really great because it's going to then be a lot easier for other enzymes to kind of attack that protein rather than if it were all balled up. All right, the second thing it does is it activates the enzyme called pepsinogen. So pepsinogen is secreted by those cells in the gastric pit, okay, and it's not active until it's in an acidic pH. So the hydrochloric acid helps to activate that. And the last thing it does is it kills pathogens that might be in our food. So our food isn't totally free of things that could harm us. It could have bacteria or parasites or something crazy in there. And so that hydrochloric acid, that acidic pH, kills these bacteria, which is why we have to be really careful if we're taking things like antacids that artificially neutralize the pH of our stomach, because it could affect its ability to get rid of these pathogens here. Okay, so we know the hydrochloric acid is good, but can it ever be bad? Yes, okay? So first of all, if you are consistently taking hydrochloric acid from the stomach and throwing it up, okay, like for people that have bulimia, that could be a problem with burning a hole in your esophagus or ruining the enamel on your teeth. Okay, so that's bad. We know that anytime this acid leaves the stomach, that's no good. But what about in the stomach itself? Shouldn't it be able to handle that because of the mucus layer? And the answer is yes, okay, that this layer of mucus should be able to protect the stomach. If not, if for some reason the acidic pH of the stomach or the acid that's in the stomach is able to eat through the mucus layer and down into the muscle layer, that's what's known as a stomach ulcer, and it looks like this. And for the longest time, we thought that stomach ulcers were caused by stress. My parents said this to me all the time. Oh, you're going to give me an ulcer. Okay, something like that. Has nothing to do with stress. Sorry, that's ruining parental manipulation all over the world, but it has nothing to do with stress and everything to do with a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. And H. pylori is one of these crazy suckers that's able to actually withstand that low pH, that acidic environment of the stomach. And it can actually infect this mucosal lining. Stomach ulcers can be not only painful and uncomfortable, but dangerous. So if you feel like you are suffering from some kind of an ulcer, you should definitely go get it checked out. Plus, then you'd get a really cool endoscopy picture of your stomach like this, and we could all look at it. It'd be great. Okay, so let's pretend for the sake of my vanity that you're enjoying this video so much that you've gone and gotten yourself a snack of some wonderful, salty, delicious potato chips. In those potato chips, you're going to find a lot of starch. So what happens when that starch, okay, enters your digestive system? Well, you see, starch is a big molecule. It's made up of many, many, many glucose monomers. And it's too big to fit across the walls of your small intestine. It can't do it. Okay, so we send in this enzyme called amylase, and we're going to find amylase in two places, either produced by the salivary glands or produced by the pancreas. We get it squirted on our food twice. The reason being is because in salivary amylase, once that food makes it to your stomach, that amylase is destroyed by the acidic pH. So then after the stomach, I got to have the pancreas squirt more on it. Anywho, that amylase is going to break down the starch into a disaccharide called maltose. That's so nice. That's really helpful. Now, the problem is that maltose is still too big to make it across the walls of your small intestine. So further down in your digestive tract, we're going to have another enzyme that's going to take these maltoses and break them down into glucoses where they can be absorbed by your small intestine. You don't need to know the name of that enzyme involved in that process. You just need to know the amylase is from, we're going to find it in two spots, the saliva and then pancreatic amylase. It takes starch and breaks it down into maltose. And then later on, something will break it into glucose, which are then, I know that you can't read that part, which are then going to be absorbed by the small intestine. Now, if I want to know how the glucose gets into the small intestine, first I really need to take a look at those villi. So don't draw this part, I just want to remind you, okay, if I took a cross section of the small intestine, I'd see those two muscular layers. Okay, and then those weird, crazy finger-like projections, okay, called the villi. So what I want to take a closer look at is just the villus. What do one of those little fingery-looking things look like up close? Okay, so here we go. It looks like this. Here's this little fingery-shaped projection. Okay, and it is lined on the outside with a row of cells. So each one of these little lumps is a cell. Should probably make them look like cells. Okay, and these cells have these tiny little hairs on them. Okay, so eventually I'm going to have to show you what one of these looks like in real life. This is looking like some kind of scary, like Minions cartoon. Okay, and so this intestinal villus, here's the villus, this whole structure, is covered in, each of these cells is called an epithelial cell. Okay, that's this guy. All right, and these epithelial cells are covered in these small projections called microvilli. Okay, now the reason we have these villi sticking out is to increase the surface area for absorption. So instead of just having a smooth small intestine, now look, I have all this more surface area. These tiny little hairs also help to increase the surface area. Okay, on the inside, we have one large vessel called the lacteal. That's an A. And the lacteal is part of the lymphatic system that's going to help us in the absorption and transport of fats. Now, we know that the goal of like eating food is to digest them, digest that food, don't draw this part, from big molecules into smaller molecules. Then we have to get those small molecules into the bloodstream, and that is called absorption. So if we're going to talk about the bloodstream, we better plan on drawing the bloodstream. Okay, so blood is going to come into the villus through what's called an arteriole, and then just watch this, it's going to flow all the way through here. So that is one blood vessel, like that. And I'm going to be really mean and cheat a little bit and color code this. I know you probably can't do that, but that's okay. All right, when it comes in here, it's carrying oxygenated blood. Okay, why is it doing that? Well, because these guys, all these cells need oxygenated blood. Okay, when it's leaving, it's going to be deoxygenated. All right. But the good news is that now it has all of the nutrients, okay, that used to be in the food, okay, are now in the bloodstream. Okay, so yeah, it's not letting me get rid of that. That's just wonderful. There we go. Okay, so something like this. Great. Okay, so where this blood comes in is called an arteriole, the smallest arteries, and it leaves through what we call a venule, the smallest veins, and of course, what connects arteries and venules? That would be our capillaries, okay? So crossing over here are multiple capillary beds, okay? So I'm going to put that out here, capillary, okay? And I'm going to label that in all three places. I realize this drawing is getting all kinds of funky, okay? Maybe if I color this lacteal, maybe that's going to look a little better for you here. Here's the lacteal, okay? That guy's green. Okay, so again, one last time, okay, the digested materials from the food are going to be absorbed either into the bloodstream, where it then leaves through the venule, or into the lacteal, where it then leaves through the lymphatic system. Okay, so as promised, here's a picture of the lumen of your small intestine. So food is kind of traveling through this tube. And these finger-like projection, these weird little alien things, those are all the villus. And on them, we can see those epithelial cells with those tiny little hair-like projections called microvilli. Okay, so again, the role of the villus, okay, is to increase the surface area for absorption. You just need to memorize that phrase, okay? Increasing the surface area for absorption. So the more surface area, the more absorption I can do. All right, the capillary bed is there to help carry those absorbed nutrients to the rest of the bloodstream. Again, the lymphatic tissue helps in that too. So some of the things that might be in our food that we want to get from our food into either our blood system or our lymphatic system include things like water, glucose, amino acids, nucleotides, fatty acids, minerals, vitamins, okay, all kinds of crazy nonsense. Okay, we need all of those to get from our food, okay, into other parts of our body. Now, the mechanism for which they actually get absorbed into the lacteal or into those capillary beds is going to depend, okay? So we're going to use both passive and active transport. In terms of passive transport, okay, remember, these are things that do not require energy because they're going down the concentration gradient. So from areas where there's a high concentration to areas where there's a low concentration. Two examples of the way that this is going to look in our digestive system, okay, simple diffusion. So again, that's going to be going from high to low through the phospholipids though. Okay, so it's going to have to be something non-polar to get past these super grumpy hydrophobic tails. So that's going to be like our fatty acids. We're also going to be using facilitated diffusion, which again, no energy goes from high to low. The only difference is that it's going through a protein. Okay, so this is going to be, for example, like glucose might do this, ions might do this, okay, a bunch of different ways. Glucose is only going to do this, again, when the concentration of glucose is higher in the lumen of the intestine than it is in your intestinal villus cells. So if here's my villus, okay, it's got to have a lower concentration than the food in order for this to move through via facilitated diffusion, because it has to be from high to low. Now, let's say my villus already has a pretty high concentration of glucose, but in the lumen of my small intestine, there's still glucose sitting in there that I want to make sure that I absorb. So in order to get that glucose into the cell and go against the concentration gradient, I'm going to need to use active transport. Remember, this requires energy, okay, because I'm probably moving things up or against the concentration gradient. So although glucose can move via facilitated diffusion, it can also move via active transport. It all depends on the concentration gradient, okay? So I'm going to need a membrane pump if the food has a relatively low concentration compared to the cells, but I want to make sure I'm able to get that food into the cells or that glucose from the food into the cells, I'm gonna need to pump it. I might also have to use some endocytosis to move things in there every now and then as well. Okay, so let's zoom in a little further. Again, here's a villus. It's lined with these epithelial cells that have these microvilli on them. And I'm going to zoom in on just a couple of them, okay? So let's say, again, maybe we want to kind of draw where we're at here. Here's my villus and my epithelial cells. Let's say I'm going to zoom in on just this portion. Okay, so that means that I'm going to have a few cells, and they're going to look like this. They're going to have those microvilli on the outside. So there's one cell. Here's the next cell. Here's the next cell. Okay, so maybe I only have room for 3 cells. All right, and so remember out here is the lumen. Well, I don't really need to write it here, but out here is the lumen of the small intestine. Remember, it's going all the way around these villi. So maybe that's an important part of my drawing. Here's the lumen, okay? And in here would be the actual villus, okay? Including the bloodstream, okay? And the lacteal and all that other good stuff. Facing here on the inside, so facing in here or in here, it's gonna be wavy. They're not going to be flat, okay? So again, here are my microvilli. They increase surface area for absorption. And these little folds here, the side that's facing the inside, these are called invaginations. An invagination just means fold. Okay, so there's like folds in their cell membrane. Again, this also increases the surface area for stuff to move from these epithelial cells into either the lacteal or the capillary beds. Okay, between each cell, we're going to find that there's really not very much space. So I'm going to kind of color that in. Okay, these are what we call tight junctions. And these tight junctions prevent food or absorbed nutrients from moving from cell to cell to cell. Remember, the goal is to move things from the lumen of the small intestine through these into the capillary or lacteal. We don't want it going from here this way. So we have these kind of tight junctions to prevent that. Okay, in the inside of the cells, of course, they're going to have their nuclei. That's fine. You can draw them if you really can't bear to draw a cell without a nucleus and you know it's there. But they're also going to be full of mitochondria, and I have no chance at drawing all these on this screen, okay? They're going to be chock full of mitochondria, like a whole lot. All right, so by now you should know that mitochondria are the site of aerobic cell respiration. So if I have a lot of mitochondria, that must mean I'm doing a lot of aerobic cellular respiration because I need to produce a lot of ATP. I need to produce a lot of ATP because I'm going to be doing a lot of active transport. I'm going to either have to actively transport stuff from the food, okay, in the lumen into these cells, or I'm going to have to pump them from these cells into the bloodstream. But either way, I'm going to need a lot of ATP from those mitochondria. So now I want you to go back and annotate your drawing with the functions that we just talked about. So we just talked about the function of the mitochondria. You also need to talk about why they have tight junctions. What are the purposes of these microvilli? And what are the purposes of these invaginations? Okay, so let's think about, okay, what's going to happen if your intestines are so super awesome at absorbing all of those nutrients? By the time your food makes it through the small intestine, all of those useful things have already been absorbed by the villi. So what's going to be left? Well, it's going to be your feces. So your feces is pretty much made of leftovers, like things that you couldn't absorb. Okay, so the things we can't absorb are going to include things like cellulose. We cannot absorb things from plant cell walls. That's why you often see plant material like corn in your poop. Okay, you can't digest or absorb those things. Bile, okay, so some of the bile from the gallbladder, that's what's responsible for the color. If your poop is white, you're probably experiencing some kind of liver dysfunction. You should go to the doctor. It should be brown and gross looking. Okay, and then there's a whole crap load of bacteria in here, which is why it doesn't smell very nice. Now, how do we make sure that the food gets through our digestive system and then out in an efficient manner? Well, this is where fiber comes in. So you've probably seen this on commercials or hear it from your grandparents. Eat your fiber. Okay, well, what is fiber? Well, fiber is mostly cellulose, okay, from plant cell walls. So if all you ever eat is chicken nuggets and ice cream, you're probably not getting enough fiber. You got to have those plant cell walls in there, and that's going to be from things like fruits, vegetables, whole grains. Okay, since it's not digested, it provides bulk to your food. So it never gets smaller and smaller and smaller. It always stays in there. And this is going to help food move through, keep moving, people, flushing out your intestines. Okay, so that's good. We need things to keep moving in there because we don't want it to sit in our small intestines and decay. That's bad. Okay, it's also nice because since we don't digest it in our stomach and other places, it's putting pressure on our intestines and stomach, and it's making us feel full. But again, because we don't digest it, we don't get any calories from it. So it's feeling full without having any calories. It's the ultimate cheat food. Okay, so I hope this helped you understand the digestive system a little more, maybe brought up some interesting questions, and that'll do it for Chapter 6.1 and D2 on digestion.